fundamental things at a time when fundamental things in our technology and culture, and therefore obviously, hopefully obviously in architecture, are shifting without necessarily being examined or questioned. Indeed, to address architecture at such a basic level has been overlooked for some time by even the smartest in the discipline. For example, Rem's recent Venice Biennale was labeled Fundamentals, but should more properly, I think, have been titled Elements or Things, since it did not address architecture at a philosophical level per se, but just exhibited a sort of a history and taxonomy of architectural bits, like stairs and toilets. And all of those bits themselves more frankly related to building than architecture. In fact, what was missing in a noticeable way, I think, was the discussion that would have addressed the distinction between those labels. A recent related volume titled The Building, which purports to offer a so-called theory corrective to 3 decades of discourse ignoring this ostensible point of architecture. That is, all the isms and techniques imported from outside the field that more or less uniformly resulted in stuff that frankly had little to do with buildings. This volume itself misses the architectural end of the equation while consumed with staring at the building, but to be honest, not really seeing that either, in my opinion. Now, if there are historians here, and I see one, they will likely be outraged at the liberties I take in the following discussion with the professional humility of historiography, particularly when I talk about progress. I can only say to them, think of this as a heuristic approach to issues that we might otherwise have to pass over in silence, to quote Wittgenstein. Think of it as a provocation to continued discussion or conversation. So, what do I mean by the idea of architecture, and why don't I just talk about architecture? What's the difference between architecture and the idea of architecture? In fact, as these 2 examples that I gave, Rem and the book The Building show, architecture seems to be kind of a blind spot these days, especially for those whose job it is to think about architecture. In the Army, I learned that when you stare at something in a poorly lighted environment, it tends to disappear. You're supposed to instead kind of look around, keeping your eyes moving all the time. So this is a little bit of what we'll be doing here this afternoon. So you may not recognize the architecture that you think you know in what follows. What I'm after here is the very most basic thinking about the architectural. More basic than Charmsau and Riegel's late addition of space to the formula. More basic than the later elevation of program as function to the mix. More basic even than the association with building or tectonics, or the idea that it's all just political or social or even data. The idea of architecture marks the threshold for architectureness, and thus precedes its presence and recognition as such, which is to say that the idea of architecture precedes the definition of architecture and covers the things we know about architecture that the definition doesn't say, because they're already presumed. They go without saying. So the idea of architecture covers the things that allow the definition to actually mean something, that allow it to occur in the first place. They make the definition necessary and worth attempting. Here are some famous definitions which I submit are meaningless unless you already know what architecture is. That is, unless you already have an idea of architecture. This one should be familiar. Architecture is, quote, the masterly, correct, and magnificent play of mass brought together in light. Hopefully you guys recognize who said that. Another famous guy, Mies, said architecture is, quote, when two bricks are brought together carefully, somehow conveying in this, quote, the will of the epic translated into space. Frank Lloyd Wright said architecture is, quote, the reaction of a creative mind to a problem in the nature of materials. And then, even more expansively, he said, quote, architecture is the scientific art of making structure express ideas. Architecture is the triumph of human imagination over materials, methods, and men to put man into possession of his own earth. Now, of course, Frank Lloyd Wright was writing, a long time ago, so that's why he's using that pronoun. Architecture is man's great sense of himself embodied in a world of his own making. In comparison, my mentor, Peter Eisenman, is absolutely gnomic. He says, quote, architecture is building plus the sign of building. In contrast, again, Nicholas Pevsner, who was basically the font of all architectural knowledge during the middle of the last century, tries to be clear rather than poetic. He says, quote, a bicycle shed is a building. Lincoln Cathedral is a piece of architecture. He goes on to say, nearly everything that encloses space on a scale sufficient for a human to move in is a building. The term architecture applies only to buildings designed with a view to aesthetic appeal. But unless you already know what architecture is, even Pevsner's clarity is not so useful. How is a bicycle shed, for example, designed with a view to aesthetic appeal, not just an aesthetically appealing bicycle shed? Even the simplest, most straightforward definition among these, Eisenman's, depends on some prior sense of what we are talking about. We have to know what buildings are and what signs are, and we have to understand an additive relationship between them. Let's heuristically distill it down even further to note that what is added to building, the sign, specifically calls it out as different somehow. When the sign is added then, we can safely call the thing so labeled, that building, special. So then an even more basic version of Eisenman's most basic version would be that architecture is building that is different or special. If we're going to approach this at a fundamental level, as a fundamental question, we can't stop here though. We have to wonder, what is this thing that has been called out as special? What is building? Why special building? Why not special something else? And are we to associate architecture just with the combination or with that specialness itself? Is the idea of architecture something associated after the fact with particular buildings? Or does building come after an idea of architecture makes it conceivable at all, as a product of that idea, as an instance of the specialness of that idea? And what kind of specialness points toward or fixes on building? For the purposes of this discussion today, I'm going to treat the question of priority as a historical matter rather than a purely logical one. But think of it like a fable to illustrate a point, rather than a strict accounting in that regard. And in fact, it's actually sort of easy to imagine building evolving first in response to or guided by some prior sense of what it was supposed to be. A prior sense of what it was supposed to be that we could call an architectural sense. In that case, it would also be natural to understand building itself as a product then of that prior sense, to see that it would take something like a sense of the architectural to get folks out of the caves, to make them believe that they could prosper out under the sky. If building as shelter comes first, then we're in familiar territory, and I won't spend any time on that. But if special is prior, what do we really mean? What we're asking about here is a difference beyond or other than that associated with shelter. That is, beyond survival, something other than an appreciation of what makes the atlatl better than the javelin, or the Acheulean axe more special than a plain rock. This specialness, in other words, is different than betterness. Architecture is not better building. Buildings and atlatls and axes' goodness are measured on a different scale, according to a different value system. You've all heard me talk about the difference between engineering and architecture. Building is engineering, and better building is better engineering, not architecture. So, special building. In fact, we can imagine a human capacity for wonder and an appreciation of specialness arising before building and engineering, and then we can imagine it guiding more prosaic efforts like shelter, and then investing the results with the specialness that inspired them. Which is to say that at some point, humans started to care about something not immediately related to the everyday procurement of food, fertility, or the avoidance of death. Something not tied directly to the prosaic attainment of shelter. I propose that what we mean by the kind of specialness that might be associated with architecture begins here. In particular, I submit that it emerges out of the realm of magic associated with these. Before building, maybe as far back as the deep Paleolithic, evidenced in the cave paintings like at Lascaux or Altamira. Though its relationship to survival is not quantifiable in the way of the axe or spear, Paleolithic and Neolithic magic was not casual. The difficulty involved in its practice, and likely uneven success, speaks to its desperation, telling us it must have been directed at the most important aspects of the lithic experience. Things like fertility or death or hunger. The drawings on the cave walls were likely not mere illustrations. The difference of the magical concern from the normal or effective concern with these things is that magic arises from the impulse to exhibit intentionality in the absence of a real object. It is, in this sense, literally meta or allophysical. Magic fixates on bringing into presence something through conjuring, or some knowledge or information through divination, or it is interested in preventing the presence of something and warding off evil, escaping death or mortality. Now, in this, I'm not excluding the sort of illusion that we think of as magic today, sleight of hand, for example, because in fact, this still carries some of the sense of what comes to mind when we're thinking about architecture, while at the same time, it is interesting to note the relative status of architecture today as similarly reduced. Magic makes the drawings on the cave wall not mere illustrations, in other words. It makes them present as exhibited intentionality in a way that their existence as marks of ochre or charcoal could not. Even when hidden deep away in caves, even when made solely for the use of the shaman, magic is presentational in the sense that it must be witnessed and acknowledged to be effective. But that intention is uniquely intransitive. It is neither towards an object or another person. It is neither about effect nor communication. It results in a specialness, a special thing that is not a tool because, as magical, it does not objectively do anything. Maybe someday we will come to call it art. So magic first situates twin issues that become key points in the accumulating idea of architecture, as distinct from building. And those are presence and intentionality. And it offers these before, beyond, or apart from meaning and communication. Perhaps another way to put this that is more familiar, using more contemporary terminology, is to say that architecture was affective before it was effective. To say architecture happens before affect is deployed in service of, or despite, effects, like communication. And it was as magic that affect appeared. And it appeared to contrast with effect or function. Affect, of course, is the experience of non-functional performative effects without communication. Or as Kipnis describes it, quote, disciplinary tricks absent signification. The affective dimensions of remarkable presence and intentionality, or specialness, are for architecture manifest in two ways. And these move architecture away from, finally, away from magic's origin and towards a relationship to what we will come later to know as building. And this is also a move away from mute affect and towards overt expression. And these are the delimitation of habitable space, i.e. building, and the expression of idea, or specialness, first seen as magic. So just as we ask what is prior between specialness and building in the formula architecture equals special building, so we might suspect by now that these two associations, space and ideas, are intertwined in the same chicken or egg way. Is expression simply the, quote, delimitation of space? Or conversely, is expression itself an idea that is evident through the delimitation of space? If the former, the remarkable expression of space delimited, then we're back to the possibility of there being some prior sense of the architectural that leads to this delimitation. If the latter, then what is that idea? So this, I submit, is a threshold to the possibility of the idea of an idea of architecture, at least one that we might recognize. This is the edge of history, before language enters the picture and the conversation begins, before specialness or affect gives way to expression, and begs the question then of what is expressed, what is the idea, allowing the question about which is prior, delimitation or expression, to actually be asked. By this point, the question makes sense, though. Presence, intention, space, and expression are in the house, so to speak. Together they give us the remarkable presence of a relation to space and the potential for architecture as an idea. The next ingredient, then, is the house itself, I suppose. The glue that binds all these and retrospectively prompts questions of priority. And that is, in fact, the fact of order. So for humans, order evolves naturally, outside the mere delimitation of space. It evolves through natural selection, not magic, as a general expectation and condition. It evolves into the world alongside and in service of civilization's organizational arrangements and requirements. In considering order beyond spatial definitions and its obvious relation to the idea of architecture, we are again led into a chicken or egg question. Did an idea of architecture foster the emergence of order? Or was order something that made architecture conceivable? Does architecture express the fact of order in the mode of spatial definition? Or does the visible order in certain spatial compositions suggest architecture? Certainly today, the two terms, architecture and order, are almost synonymous. Certainly when applied to issues of making stuff, whether that stuff is buildings, computers, or fashion. So at this point, in my version of the story, I skip forward to the Greeks, where, according to Heidegger, everything related to our Western architectural traditions, or discipline at least, begins. And at this point, I tentatively accept as axiomatic the view that this order is most importantly and obviously manifest in buildings. Buildings are, after all, the most resource-intensive, physically imposing, technically advanced product of emergent civilization. And the fact that you know that's no longer the case is one of the problems that architecture is facing now as a discipline. Further, I think the Greeks in all this rather than the Egyptians. Despite the obvious evidence of order in prior Egyptian monuments, its ambition is alien, unhuman, selfishly oriented to the service of the pharaoh in his or her afterlife. It recalls the torchlit magic of Lascaux in its desperate thanatological fantasy. For architecture, I think it was a dead end, pun intended. On the other hand, the sense of order in Greek works has emerged from the cave, deploying the magic of reason, called philosophy, in the service of life. Specifically, it connects the specialness, the magic, to the individual viewer, metaphorically projecting the living, thinking individual's identity and relation to society and the cosmos into the form and composition of the building. These start with the well-documented similes relating to the orders relating the orders to the body itself, but feature as well the way that body is free out under the sun in the sky. Our Western intellectual tradition begins here, and so with it, our Western idea of architecture. Architecture is us, writ large. Trachtenberg, historian, says, quote, "The Greeks, perhaps more than any other culture, lived at the razor's edge of the historical process. The Greeks were the last of the megalithic architects. Suddenly in Greece emerged a radical new sense of the nature of man and his place in the scheme of things. That man should strive to create his own destiny, to exercise his intellect and his will, even against the gods. Man became the measure of all things, including the divine." And Scully, that other Vince Scully, who you may not be familiar with because he did not broadcast for the Dodgers, but spent his life at Yale. The Greek temples, he says, stand like the Greek culture which imagined them, at a central point in human history, at the moment in time when the deepest past, with all its instinctive intuitions, fears, joys, and reverences, was brought for a while into harmony with the hard challenges of a new and liberated thought. At the moment, that is, when the self and objects outside the self were alike identified as objective realities. So, fast forward to the Greeks then, past the obvious advances in construction, organization, and even representation that the Egyptians achieved, because the Greeks put the thinking human at the center. In contrast to the Egyptians and to the later Romans, both of whom used architecture to assert the authority and control of the state, the Greeks make relatable, discrete objects, dynamically balanced in space, inviting a dialogue between the moving subject and the obliquely viewed building, between the building and the surrounding landscape. And that building, its arrangement of parts and their proportions, is an assertion of the human. As such, it stands in ordered relation to other humans and to the landscape. The Greek building is self-confident in its position in space, but respectfully tuned to its place in the landscape and to its location with respect to the society of other buildings. So with the Greeks then, order becomes clear and visible. As such, it becomes subject to deliberation. Rules are developed to aid in this deliberation. The orders emerge. This system of rules, which Vitruvius will pass on to us, map out a world of possibilities that reward responsible engagement with sublime results, that unites the delimitation of space with the expression of an idea. The system leads to confidence. It leads to complicity and conviction. The system of rules also creates a community out of those who share and grapple with them. And this initiates perhaps the punchline of the whole talk, which is that finally, at the end of the day, architecture, its idea, its practice, its definition, is community property, and ultimately subject to the community's collective, statistically determined, perhaps, will. At the center of all this, though, always and continuing, is the human. Within the context of projection, the rules encourage, even demand, her judgment and reasoned argument or rationality. Judgment is what happens when rules are not arbitrary and thus are subject to consideration and improvement. When rules must be engaged rather than passively observed, discernment is required, not merely implementation. The rules are not arbitrary, but neither are they dictated by physical necessity. They are not natural. This is not engineering. They are human. The wood structure is recast in stone. What was structural or an effect of construction is now expressive and an affect of reason. This wiggle room of expression separation from the strictest structural efficiency leads to the regime of refinement for which the Greeks are so well known. The finely tuned proportions, the optical corrections, the entasis, the crepidoma arc, tapering cella walls, leaning columns, the corner metabe and triglyph problem, the corner column fiddling and adjustments, all this is evidence of this idea of discernment and refinement happening within a structure of rules. So with judgment, in this case, in this context, comes discrimination and comparison. And with that, the recognition that some examples are better than others. And then, it is a short logical step from there to the realization that there might just be a best of something. The notion of the ideal, discovered in this way, replaces a certainty previously available only to theological revelation. It replaces it with reasoning, thereby updating the specialness born in the caves as magic with a sense of conviction that does not default to superstition or faith. What makes this projective is that the thinking subject is engaged in a dialogue with the object itself, rather than taking orders from a deity. As Heidegger suggests in his discussion of aletheia, the rules and the ideal they support are suggested by the object and witnessed by the putative author. They're not imposed by some outside agency. So, in bringing the truth to pass, as revealed by the stuff itself, did architecture briefly come to a level of highest refinement? Did it achieve the ideal? Did it become complete in Greece? And most importantly, would that achievement shut down judgment and the freedom that that judgment signifies? In other words, if architecture is judgment embodied, what happens to judgment after the ideal is reached? If judgment is not going to be exercised in the furtherance of ideality, of the perfectly harmonious, the just measure, sophrosyne, then where can judgment go? Do you just endlessly repeat that ideal and forego judgment? Or do you start over? The answer leads into territory that is more recognizably contemporary. In fact, it goes sideways, to invention, to difference, to novelty. After the magic that introduces specialness, and the reason that discovers order, this is the final big change for the idea of architecture. It starts after the glories of Periclean Athens have already populated the landscape with examples of achieved ideals. As Trachtenberg said, quote, "Beyond the Parthenon would be no further development, only exaggerated invention." After the Parthenon is built, the expectations of change set in place by a regime of refinement no longer have an ideal for guidance, so judgment must find some other measure. This other measure was an orgy of Hellenistic invention, which began a routine that continues to the present, as the discipline ranges between high periods and Mannerist periods, revolutionary avant-gardist phases and establishment phases, always fueled by judgment's hunger for the difference that may be judged. The aimless, idealless difference and stylistic invention of the Hellenistic scene was eventually rescued from disappearing up its own ass by Roman technical innovation, legitimately called progress, as the Romans adopted the Greek orders for their own works. As has often been the case since this first crisis of achieved ideality, it was engineering progress that stepped in to calm things down and provide a challenge adequate to the fevered imaginations of the designers and a direction appropriate to their efforts. The Romans built in the Greek orders throughout their whole history, even when their actual technology had advanced far beyond the earlier trabeated construction system of the Greeks. Concrete technology, both vaulting and arcuation, gave a real necessity to this ongoing invention, while further relaxing the relation between actual and apparent structure that began with the order's evolution into stone. Material and technological advances, and the state organization taking advantage of them, led to the scale increases of the theaters, baths, fora that necessitated accommodation by the orders. At such scales, the whole assembly was so vast and complicated that it could not be taken in at once. Symmetries and optical corrections were pointless. In contrast to the layout of a Greek acropolis or agora, where the buildings are always presented to the observer on the oblique, reinforcing the observer's own autonomy, Roman fora used space as a controlling force, symmetrical, axial, complete, closed, and figural, rather than as an open medium of free bearing. The projective connection to the individual viewer disappears, and judgment suffers. To say that architecture is the embodiment of judgment, as I have written elsewhere, and I'm asserting here, I guess, does not yet tell us how that judgment operates, though, or how architecture is distinguished thereby from other intentional activities that rely on judgment. The difference is that in architecture's case, the role of judgment is noticeable. It's part of what makes it special in that notice. Whatever judgment regime is operative, whether it's novelty or excellence. So progress, whether it's difference or improvement, needs an anchor, which assigns the direction that leads to difference or improvement, and provides the frame of reference for that comparative judgment. Now, as an indication of how basic this comparative judgment is, I submit that it is this, finally, that situates architecture's historically assumed relation to building, rather than the other way around. Yet, again, another chicken or egg thing. In other words, building is no more than the context that gives judgments of betterness, or progress, as I'm calling it here, a direction and meaning, which makes building, frankly, less essential to architecture than the idea of comparative judgment or progress, and so loosens the architectural sense to be applied to other media, as it is increasingly these days. At the end of all that, then, now that we can say we sort of know what we're talking about, here's my own definition of architecture, my own current definition, I should say, reflecting architecture's present diffuse state and the particular dilemma of the discipline. Architecture is a visibly willful statement about medium-specific order that places us in the world. Notice the lack of any reference to building here. Now, I think most of you will grant me the first part of this. Architecture is visible, whether physical or not, even when it's just an idea. Architecture is willful, of course, and in a way that qualifies as self-conscious, which is the customary way to distinguish architecture from vernacular stuff. Architecture is engaged and produced as architecture. Architecture is what architects do. It's what architects do. Architecture is a statement. This is a little more controversial in the age of affect, when signification is not a given. I used to say embodiment, but I think that does not really capture the possibility that the instance of architecture that is being considered might actually be against order, like some contemporary work, frankly, presented as architecture. So instead I say it is a statement about order. Architecture is medium specific. Yes, that medium has historically been building, but lately it has wandered into fashion, computer science, and just about any activity in which order is important. In fact, this diffusion is the big change these days. Despite the fact that tectonics is the only thing architecture owns outright and exclusively, tectonics is itself an instance of medium-specific order. I feel this is deeper than the association with building that tectonics celebrates. And in fact, in today's diffusion, we see architecture demonstrating that. That finally then brings us to the beef. What does it mean, quote, to place us in the world? Does it mean express, reflect, or suggest a relationship? And here I think is where architecture is finally rooted. This is the lowest subatomic level of consideration. When we get to this question, all the others preceding it fade to less essential additives or adjectives. The answer, how architecture does this, what it does, is what makes it architecture finally, across all applications, across all media and platforms. Here is where the essential difference between the architectures we might typically catalog through history by their stylistic variation or formal differences, this is where it's truly found. Architecture has indulged all the modes of placement imaginable. In fact, their variation through time indexes the strength of the discipline. In times when the discipline is strong, then expression is robust, and meaningful invention follows. During times when the discipline is weak, then expression melts into a passive, even helpless default as reflection. Further, the condition of the world picture itself can be correlated to this, in that the clearer the world picture and the more general its subscription, the stronger the discipline, and vice versa. The muddier the picture, the more fragmented the terms of possibility, the weaker the discipline and the greater the dissipation. In all these cases, though, whether on purpose or not, architecture provides a framework for understanding, a reduced or distilled version of the relationship to the world that allows at least an illusion of the control of otherwise uncontrollable aspects. Now, some may recognize this as a game structure. Architecture places us in the world by placing us in this framework, locating us in the game. The framework, in turn, for architecture, is the discipline. Architecture's relationship to the world in each possible channel of expression, reflection, mirroring, constructing occurs as both a structuring and affective or emotive presence. Today, the world picture is muddy. In fact, it's about muddiness. In the movement from modern to post-critical, we cannot regain earnestness, or conversely, we cannot escape irony. This influences the confidence with which any structuring effort may be engaged, the solidity of any assertion made by its presence, and thus the assurance with which the game may be played. Absent any widely shared conviction, we see instead a fragmentation of the field into so many micro-directions. The deeper levels, where the discipline engages or generates the kind of meaning that makes architecture useful in importance, cannot be plumbed when each project is an island unto itself. Since a discipline's structuring role facilitates comparative judgments, providing the connective tissue or language or common ground, a weak discipline further isolates the individual efforts from each other. And this turns architecture into a passive reflection of what is locally possible in the world, rather than a positive expression of what should be universally desired. And it undermines whatever constructive efforts architecture attempts. Today, when this function of placing us in the world, that began with the Greek sense of projection, can be fulfilled by media other than building, because our presence in the world is no longer as sheltered or spatially circumscribed, there must be another reason to associate architecture with this role, which it still demands. That is to say, we are not sheltered or circumscribed in the world today. We are free there. And architecture's role in placing us there must be rethought now with respect to this freedom. Previously, as a matter of shelter and spatial circumscription, architecture's activity of placement was protective, comforting, assuring us of an identifiable place in an otherwise hostile or indifferent environment. This was important in a period when the idea of shelter as necessary for survival still resonated, and when location mattered to identity. Today, those memories are gone, and with the notable exception of the homeless, the idea of shelter is more abstract, and post-geographic identity is the norm. Today, again with some exceptions like global warming, we face a world that is less physically threatening, and the world's indifference is less depressing, frankly, because it does not represent the loss of a god. Instead, we are, for better or worse, liberated to possibilities and are urged everywhere to take advantage. But we cannot simply abide. In this world, Architecture's value as a medium of placement derives from a statement of rightness or order that is not referential but intrinsic. Work, building or other, rediscovers its progressive, superlative state in architecture in such a world only as an example of a most visible physical embodiment of the possibility of advantage taken, of possibilities realized, and all as evident in the rightness or order achieved thereof. No longer exclusive to building, though, this visible expression of achievement and order we call architecture may itself find an outlet in other media. So it's possible to respond to Hugo that while, quote, this will kill that, there's now architecture in both this and that. And what has been killed is simply the body or form or medium, rather than the spirit or soul. But there is a rightness or order that runs through all these media that makes them amenable to, quote, the architectural, the discipline. This is not the tectonic, though, despite the fact that tectonics is the only thing that architecture owns outright, that it doesn't share with art or engineering. It is instead the more basic mechanical. The mechanical best captures the way that we relate to the world as meat objects, governed by physics, and thus describes that spirit common to media that is engaging in the way that we associate with the architectural. For 2 million years, we evolved in such an environment, as an object among objects, and this has formed our bodies and our minds, our common sense, our intuitions and instincts. For this reason, the mechanical sense is universally legible and empathetic. You will guess by now that this conversation is game about what is deepest, most essential, in this definitively inessential or elective phenomenon we call architecture. Well, here it is, folks, the real bottom. This time, I really, really mean it. This is before oviparity, before chickens or eggs. It is what makes chickens and eggs identifiable as such, as separate things between which a question of priority even makes sense. So all thinking about the idea of architecture involving magic, order, progress, or anything else starts with an assumption of objects and relatability. We are objects which architecture places in a world of objects. And their placement, whether by expression, reflection, or suggestion, cannot be understood except by reference that depends on mechanical understanding, aware or not. Objects and their relatability, as a play of masses and light, willful statements about medium specificity, placement of things in the world, buildings plus value, buildings plus the signs of buildings, as architecture, in other words, are always singled out as different from something else, and that play occurs across this difference. This difference is what makes it visible. Its visibility is what makes it different, what makes it special, what shows its value. Different always, but not other. Projection ties it to us, while the comparative impulse always connects it to the thing compared, establishing the relationship as points along a graduated line, a gauge. If it is architecture, it is judged so, as more, as better, as a superlative of building, a significant building, a visible engagement of medium, an engagement that makes the medium itself visible. Comparison of examples of architecture is part of the constitutive activity of the architectural experience. Architecture is always being judged. As I've said, architecture is itself judgment embodied. So I'd like to end this conversation by thinking about how a present interest in diversity might relate to architecture. I notice the dean's not here, but is it merely a contemporary cultural interest? impacting architecture from outside, like the professional and vocational concerns of licensure and insurance-driven code requirements, or the technical borrowings of the cinema special effects industry? Or can an interest in diversity be found at a disciplinary level? Is it implied, entailed, or otherwise engaged by a definition of architecture? In other words, is it in the idea of architecture, a part of architecture's DNA? Is it a necessary effect of the ultimate fact that architecture, like everything not quantifiable, is community property and thus subject to such necessarily political negotiation? Certainly this issue is part of our world, and if architecture is supposed to place us there, then diversity is thereby necessarily engaged. But the question is whether this idea is part of the continuing thread of the discipline, transcending any particular period's interests. The question is if this idea is part of the genetic code of architecture, something that has been there all along. Well, if architecture has comparison in its DNA, then it also has an appreciation of the difference that may be compared and the necessity of that difference to its own existence. Boom. There, done. Dropping of mic. Thank you for listening. Sorry, there's supposed to be 15 minutes at the end for questions or discussion, but we got 2 minutes to get back to the studio. So if you want to take this up later, I guess come by studio or feel free to email me, but I think it would be my interest as discipline head for you all to go back to studio and be in studio now, okay? Thank you.